welcome everybody. I think we're here. So welcome to this session. I've been asked to host for HeartEdge on church-related community work alongside churches. We're talking all about, I suppose, this kind of work that happens during the week outside of a kind of Sunday service. And we're going to be talking about ideas, tactics. We've got three guests who I should introduce. In fact, I'm going to ask them, Joe, Alison and Anne, where are you? Why don't we go around and just find out a little bit about what's been going on for you during the last year? And maybe you could describe a little bit about your context and setting, and then let's dig into, we have about an hour here, so we can talk about community work and church-related community work. Later on, we'll be hearing from Steve Summers, who's linked to the United Reformed Church, or is part of the United Reformed Church, which is a denomination that's been pioneering community work for centuries, and in particular, it's church-related community work. So we should find out a little bit about that. And then we'll, if you'd like to post questions as we go, comments, a bit about where you're from, anything in terms of reacting, bung it in the chat, and we can come back to it hopefully and revisit it, and hopefully we'll dig in. I wonder, Alison, do you want to kick in? Alison Dalton, introduce yourself and a little bit about where you're from. Then we'll come to Joe Patterson, and then we'll come to Anne Honey, our three guests on the panel this afternoon. And then finally, we'll get to you, Steve, don't worry. Alison Dalton, tell us about where you're from, what you're doing.
So at the moment, I'm in Sunderland, and my pandemic has been about saying goodbye to the project I served in Bolton, and beginning to serve the project here in Sunderland. And the way I think about that is, imagine meeting people on Zoom, trying to get to know people and a new area when you've never physically met them before and you're not allowed to physically meet each other. That has been my context for the last year. But prior to that, I was also a CRCW for 9 years in Poole. So 9 years in Poole, 5 years in Bolton, and so far 1 year here in Sunderland. That's me. Now,
CRCW is the acronym for church-related community work.
Sorry, I should know better.
I'm just explaining for myself, my own benefit. But Alison, this then is a very familiar setting for you. How on earth have you been able to, build community in your new place, this new space, just presumably via Zoom? What have you been doing?
I've joined lots of Zoom, Teams networking meetings that have been gone online because of the situation. I'm lucky in this area that there are those things. But I've also, because for me, it's also about serving my church and understanding my churches. So I have found a different way of doing that. I have painted pebbles from one of the bays here, where there's a labyrinth, a public labyrinth for people that was kindly built by some community people years back in 2016. I found it quite quickly, and I go there every week to pray. And
this is an outdoor space, like in a park?
It's out just above the sea. It's beautiful, wow. Absolutely beautiful. And maybe very naughtily, I have picked up over 150 pebbles now and painted them with a labyrinth, and taken them and visited, very COVIDly secure, the people that are in the churches that I serve, so that at least they've seen me to say hello and have my phone number. That is one of the things I've done. I've walked miles across Sunderland in the process because I didn't feel safe catching a bus, and I don't drive. And that's helped me to root myself in Sunderland. But predominantly it's been phone conversations, and you rightly say Zoom conversations, getting to know people and build networks that way.
And when you're on the phone and you're chatting, is it about particular needs, issues? What's bubbling up? What are you finding you're talking about here?
lots of things. If it's church people, for instance, we've just got a recent bereavement, but one of those people, she's in her 90s. She's admitted she probably won't have the confidence to come back to church. Even though she has been so committed, and while the pandemic's been on, has made a Christmas card for everyone within that church and sent out a gift on Mothering Sunday from their mother church to every church member. So she's still very committed, but her confidence has been shot by the pandemic and probably won't come back to the church. But is worrying about the church all the time. Through to chatting through misunderstandings that people have had, through to understanding the mission of some of the churches that I'm serving, making connections, as I said, with the council community workers in the area. There are a few still here, and they've just employed some more, actually, which is quite nice. Through to the local VCAS Zoom meetings and getting to know them. I've just come from a VON, which is a similar infrastructure organisation session to talk here now. All sorts of things, a myriad of things, really.
So you feel you're getting your feet under the table kind of thing. You're getting connected with people so that when things open up a little bit, there'll be some foundation to build on.
Absolutely, but it is a lot harder, and you've got to think harder and try and work out how to do it in a different way. Okay,
I'd like to come back for more tactics and how you've approached that, Alice. And so we'll come back. But Joe Patterson, let's hear from you. Joe, what have you been up to? And, what's been the challenges, the tricky stuff for the last year or so? Maybe you could describe your work as well.
So I'm a CRCW in Peckham in South London, and we are an ecumenical partnership church with the Anglican Church, and I work with a full-time vicar. And we have a community centre that runs in the building, but the vicar and I manage the community centre, sit on trustees. It's very much a sort of joint effort, and we're working to work more closely together. So before the pandemic, we would run mental health services of various things. We would run older people's services. We also run uniformed organisations, and we have a winter night shelter. And we do, then people hire the building, so we have connections with them too. And we have church as well. But we might then also open for a couple of hours a week for just silent contemplation for anybody and everybody who lives in the area. So they can just come in and be quiet, meditate, pray, do whatever they want. So that's what we would do pre-pandemic. So it's a busy building in a really populated space. So everything closed because the Anglican Church closed all the buildings on one day. And we moved everything online that we could. So our mental health work was all done online or in phone calls, and our older people's exercise classes, for example, were all online. Our music appreciation and book group all went online. And then in July, we opened again for our mental health work. Our counselling started in August, but our art therapy group started in July in person. And we began a new project, which was delivering healthy meals to people who were isolating on our older people's programme, and using local businesses to do that. So, and then volunteers, and then gradually as the pandemic has gone on, people have come to pick it up from the church, and just last week started to eat in the building if they wanted to safely. The reason why we've done that is one of the tactics is listening to the people you're serving and what's going to help them. So from the delivery, we had conversations on the doorstep about, I'd really like to have a walk out once a week. So coming to pick up their lunch enabled them and motivated them to do that. And then chatting to people in the queue, I'd really like to sit and have my lunch with somebody at a distance. And so when we can, we have done that.
I love it.
Part of it is just listening to what people around you are telling you they're missing and how to make that work.
And you sound very busy. What, just for all of us who aren't, what's the name of the church again?
It's the Coppleston Church and Community Centre in Peckham. Okay,
so we can find you online. But tell us, I just wonder, Joe, how much of what you've described is, when you say we, it's the church, it's Coppleston, it's the church that you've just named, and how much of it is done collaboratively? How much are you working with others?
So we work with referral system for the mental health work with the South London and Maudsley Trust, for example, but we've had a relationship with them for a number of years. And we worked with the local community centre, providing volunteers and administration for their food delivery project. And then we've worked with local businesses. But then we might have guys on St Thomas's come to do strength and balance classes for older people, and they're not back yet. So we provide the space, and we then know the people who would like that and feel that that would be helpful. So we kind of in the middle of sorting out what that relationship might look like. As far as the church and community centre are concerned, the trustee board has to have church members on it.
Okay.
That's part of the constitution. And so our community centre work will have several church people attending things, but also volunteering. So we've had volunteers cooking today for our mealtime service who are from the church, but also who are from different faiths and no faith, all coming together to provide the service.
You mentioned another community centre. Are there a couple in the area?
So there are various groups doing lots of things. It's a very population dense place. And so we worked with this one on a particular food delivery project. But then we might, a lot of our community centres stopped doing things and felt unable to manage the risks, which was difficult. Whereas when we've had know that we could have a group with limited people in the building, we could risk assess it and make that happen. Whereas a lot of places have found that really difficult. And some of that is about the size of the space, and some of that is about the people working. So we have a few staff and a lot of volunteers and have been able to make that happen. But we have a massive Victorian church building with huge ceilings. And so it's a very different prospect than in a modern built place with perhaps smaller rooms. So that's why we were able to do it.
Can I ask, because the reason I asked that about the community centre and you're a church and community centre, would you describe everything you're doing as church?
Well, yeah, I mean,
church and community, doing all that activity. How much of it is it church, just what you're doing? You know, all of those.
Well, there's worship in church, and then there's bringing people together as part of a community, which in the unconditional love and grace we live with God is what should it be about. The motivations are ever so slightly different, but we're all aiming for the same values. We're all aiming for the same things. So we all collaborate on the wellness and the love for people that live in Peckham. And so surely that's the most important thing. So if you want to define church as that, then that's what we do. Okay,
I'm just interested in how you would define it. It seems like there's so much activity that's going on that feels very, very like good news to people and very restorative and supportive. And it's whether you divide it up into, church over here and community over here, or whether it gets all messed up. Talk about that, please, Jo.
Well, I think that's messy, but life is messy and the world is chaotic. And the more mess, the better. And the more people that are of different, we're all different, aren't we? The more difference there is in a room doing the same thing for another person, that's a result, isn't it? It's got to be, whether you do it in the name of your God, whatever that means to you, your Christian rootedness, or the fact that you just live on the street and that building's on your street and you've got spare couple of hours on your hands. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're forming community by helping people who are your neighbour.
Folks, if you've got questions or comments about what you're hearing, bung it in the chat and we'll come to it, because we want to make this useful to where you're at. Jo, final question. Do you feel, because you're connected in with a church, there's a whole pressure around, who's boss, the whole boss thing, the whole bums on seats. That's why we're here, isn't it? It's to get bums on seats. Can you talk about that, whether you encounter any tension around that?
I suppose there is some. You hear of, if you have so many people in your congregation, that's better because you can have your own minister and not share them and that kind of thing, and that there's a financial implication the more people you have, dependent on where you are though. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you have more people that they can give more, because that's not necessarily your congregation. I suppose for me it's not about that at all. It's about churches every day. Church can be in the pub and it can be in the hospital and it can be in the park. It can be visiting a school or running a scouting organisation or whatever it is, because that is about the coming together of people. And whether your God is the same as my God or whether you have no God in that way, I'm not sure it's the same. It matters particularly to me. And if we're all only about counting who comes at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, I think we're missing something. about living the life, to be honest.
Thanks, Joe. Really interesting. Alison and Anne, I don't know if you've got comments on that. We can come in. But Anne Honey, why don't you just describe, we'll come back to Joe and Alison shortly, but Anne, maybe you could just describe your context and what's going on, what you're up to.
Yeah, I came to Billingham. I'm a CRCW in Billingham on Teesside, and I came here about just over a year before the pandemic. So things were just beginning to get started. You'd built relationships, met the local councillors, that kind of thing. Started one or two things, made the relationship with some of the parents, and then the school across the road, which is really lucky, it's just across the road. And then boom, we got this pandemic. The building had to close. And I sat at home and went, what am I going to do? And I'm not, I'm not good at my own company. And I thought I'm in a unique position, really, because I've got all this time. I'm not shielding. I'm not vulnerable. I've got plenty of time to do stuff. So
That stuff is not a Netflix box set or BBC iPlayer or whatever. No.
No, I don't have the concentration for a whole box set.
Okay. It sounds like it's a similar situation though to Alison. How did you manage? What did you do?
I spoke to the local school, and originally I was supposed to go in and help them. I said, I'm here, make use of me. And then on the first day back after lockdown was announced, they only had 16 pupils turn up. So they didn't need me, certainly. And there was a worry about what had happened to all those vulnerable pupils who weren't turning up to school. So we're still not sure what happened there. And then I was already working at the local food bank, and an awful lot of their volunteers were now shielding, were now vulnerable and couldn't come and couldn't volunteer. So they were very short of people. So I ended up working there 2 or 3 days a week, giving out food parcels and meeting people who come to the food bank and helping them to address their problems. And because people I'd previously met knew that I had links with the food bank, I did get a lot of messages from people saying, where can I get some help? I'm struggling, we're furloughed, we've lost our job, where can I go? And it was really good to be able to point them in the right direction, not just the food bank, but the local council around here are amazing. They've got a single phone number that covered everything during lockdown. Whatever you needed, somebody to talk to, food, help with any kind of thing, you rang this number and they would give you help. So it was really good to be able to just signpost people and say, look, don't worry, please don't worry. Just talking to people on the phone is what makes a difference. So that's what I was doing, keep in contact with all the people that I had been working with.
Yeah.
And then when we started to be able to open up again, it was not still there. It's not still there because you've lost a lot of people off who are shielding, but you've still got a little bit of something. So we've slowly built up to running small groups for older people who've been on their own for 16 months. And because it's a big building, we can get 6 or 7 people in at once quite safely, sitting around, just talking, just being with somebody, because they haven't been out of the house in 16 months.
Remind us of the church again, Anne. What is the name of the church that you're...
Oh, it's St. Columba's in Billingham.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you say us and getting back up, you're referring to that church and just getting that. And you're the church relate. How do you relate to a minister or the congregation? You're a church related community worker in that setting.
Well, yeah, you have to build up that relationship when you go in. We did have a minister, but she moved to Cambridge during the pandemic. But the relationships I had with the congregation, I'd already built up because I was where they were. I need to be where they are, which is when you start any job, you are where they are. And so I had still had those relationships, and the church secretary runs the girl guides and the brownies and that sort of stuff. So it's a work, we're working together. Those who can do, and those who can't, they're very happy to pray for us, and actually to know that something is happening around the church in their name, even if they can't come out. They're really happy that something is happening.
How do you gather everybody together? How do you make those that can't feel part of something that you're kind of nurturing and growing.
Communication. It has to be communication. That's the biggest thing. And the problem with an older congregation is that an awful lot of them aren't online. So it has been phone calls or standing outside their window, going hello, and they'll come to the door, and it's communication's a key thing that some have lost, and that's a shame.
Yeah, Joe, you're nodding. Talk about this, please. You've been doing some of this.
Yeah, so I mean, similar to Anne, we would have half of our congregation not on the internet, a lot of them just with a landline, actually. And so we started doing a newsletter and delivering it after worship. And so once a fortnight. So at the beginning, everybody knew that we were coming and would come to the door and want to have a chat. And we had quite lots of blocks of flats, and we had one person, when I put it through, came to the 4th floor and sang us a hymn one day out of her balcony, because she was just happy to see that we'd come to visit her. And she was just, oh yeah, I want to share this with you. Are you going to listen? We're like, yeah, of course we are.
Wow.
So,
in some contexts, that could be an ASBO. But anyway, yeah, okay.
But you know, that was about the physical presence of a vicar and me walking around. You know, I don't wear a collar or anything, but you know, perhaps suited up after live streaming worship, and having a chat with people in the parish when it was really, really quiet. But then talking to people about who we were and what we did and why he wore a collar and all that kind of stuff, you know. And there's nothing like the face-to-face, is there? Because we had to make an effort and couldn't assume that everybody is online. And I do have a bit of a concern that we're going to assume that everybody will be able to do this all the time, and we miss people when we make that assumption as well. So I'm glad we went round on our feet, knocking on people's doors and chatting to them, you know, because
I'd like to ask Alison to comment on this, because in terms of that painting of the pebble, you're kind of using something very analog and physical, and you're connecting with people there. Before we come back to Anne, it would just be good. Alison, you were obviously reaching out and communicating with people.
Well, for me, that's the point, isn't it? You know, if we've been made in God's image, God has given us the gifts we have. There is an obligation to share our gifts. Now, I wouldn't call myself an artist, but I love messing about with stuff. And I wanted to make a physical connection with people in a time when that was not possible. And this was the only way I could think of giving a gift of myself and making a physical connection to those that I serve. And that was shown in the effort I put into doing it, but also in giving it to them and ensuring they were safe. And so many people were so pleased for that connection and wanted that chat on their doorstep. It was lovely. But it was only the beginning. And the next tactic was to write in the monthly newsletter for one church, the 2 monthly newsletter for another church, which was still happening, being distributed both by email and post within all this time, and writing very differently to how I would normally write in a church newsletter, because they didn't know me. So I was more personal and more open about me, because this was a way that they could get to know me.
That's really helpful. And it's interesting, the emphasis on, you know, the snail mail, the written, the bit of paper thing alongside the email, which feels like maybe a lot of work, but it's connecting with people. Keep the comments, questions coming in the chat, please. Really good stuff. We will get to this, but let's pack it out, bung some more in. And I just want to ask you, you were talking a little bit about your work with the school and groups, you know, in an area where there's a huge amount of need. It's interesting, Dot in the chat says it's all about building relationships. I wonder, though, whether you've encountered people who really want to co-opt you and want you to do their thing. And, you know, you suddenly feel that you're getting co-opted into doing a whole lot of things that are really, really important, but it's a challenge in terms of how you prioritize. I don't know whether you've encountered that, and whether you could just comment on that kind of, you know, struggling the priorities as you're new in and making contacts and connections, and it's coming at you, you know.
Yes, it is. And there are people who think that I should be doing their job for them as well. But I think with a conversation, you can usually say, well, yeah, okay, we'll do this together. And then hopefully other people can come on board and take over. I mean, we are here to do ourselves out of a job, really. So you start things off and maybe you'll think, oh, do you know, they're asking a bit much. But you do what you can anyway, and you get somebody else to help you. And who knows what might happen come out of that. The spirit moves and things just happen sometimes.
I really want you to talk about that phrase, we're doing ourselves out of a job. That feels so difficult. As a community worker, you know, that feels to me like a huge challenge. So I don't know, Anne, whether you could comment on some tactics and approaches that you do that are all about enabling, facilitating, you know, just stuff that, you know, enables people to for you to start to do yourself out of a job and see people take responsibility. Before you do, just to give a little thinking time, Steve is going to come on to that question in the chat shortly, just about how you define church-related community work, because what I'm hearing sounds like mission. We will ask Steve to talk about that, but Anne, help me out on this.
How do I do myself out of a job?
Yeah.
It is about enabling and it is about encouraging. And a lot of people in churches or around who come to volunteer for things, they think they can't do something. And they've been disempowered because nobody's ever told them that they could do it and do it really well. And it's given them the chance. And sometimes I just show them that, you know what, I'm not perfect. I can't do it either. Sometimes I'm a total idiot and things will go wrong. I've got an apprentice at the moment, a student working with me.
Yeah.
And at Christmas, I did, you know, get things wrong because I'm not very good with spreadsheets. And
Spreadsheets. Okay.
Spreadsheets. So organization isn't necessarily my best thing. So everybody found out that I'm absolutely rubbish at some things, and that's okay, because it's all right to be rubbish with things, because you listen to other people who show you. And now Fliss taught me how to use a spreadsheet. It's changed my life.
Brilliant. Well
there
done.
You go.
Nice one.
So I can, you know, if somebody can change my life, they can change everybody's life.
But there's something there about inviting someone to participate, and then it's not necessarily about doing a good job. It's about you showed up and you did the job, and that's brilliant. And reflecting on that a little bit.
You were here. Your presence was here. You did that. We did that together, and that encourages people.
That feels so important. Alison, you were going to say something. Then maybe Joe, you want to come in. But yeah, Alison.
Well, I was just thinking, it's also thinking about what our job is. So our job can be about changing a culture in an area. I mean, it's definitely about empowering other people, but it might not look the same as when we were doing it. If I may talk about a previous project, which was in Poole in Dorset, and when I went there was no community fund days across the areas that I served, 2 council wards at all. We spent 6 years doing 4 events per year. It was around new development, so it was around bringing the established community and the new communities together, because there had been some tension and some misunderstandings and some labeling of people, which wasn't good. And in those 6 years, we learned stuff about doing that. But also by year 6, we realised that we'd helped form new residents associations. The town centre management saw what we were doing and loved it. The community library that we were involved with helping to set up and be developed, loved it. So we shared our learning with them and stopped doing them. And those events were still happening, but they weren't looking the same as what we'd done. But they now were still able to continue even when that project finished. So it's not necessarily doing what we do, but doing similar things in a different way that have a longer life.
Brilliant. Interesting. Okay. I mean, Joe, I wonder if you could just talk about how you enable and facilitate this kind of participation, knowing that sometimes maybe you're being evaluated and judged, but you're taking a risk at bringing people in to to do, you know, who you're inviting to participate in something, to take part in something?
So a number of our volunteers and sometimes staff and trustees have been people who've used the things that we offer. So they might have come through mental health service, for example, and then they want to do something, or we say, oh, you listen to what they've done in their life and think, aha, right, okay. Or they've never been asked. Some people are just set aside and never asked, aren't they, to do anything, to volunteer, or because it's just an assumption made at their circumstance that they can't, and that's not how we do it. So we made our volunteer process really easy, because there's a lot of new guidance, isn't there, about what you should do in churches. And for our community centre as well, we made a process where people can have a conversation with us about why they can't provide a reference, or why their DBS check might be a problem, or whatever. And it doesn't mean that we say no. It means that we find a way around it to make it safe for everybody, but so that they can still participate. And I think that's what we need to do, is to say that anybody can do things, and you need an opportunity, and we will give you the opportunity to do that. So I worked with somebody who'd never run a church group before, and then I gradually just made myself unavailable, and this was several years ago, and she's now a trustee of the board of the community centre. So she just needed some confidence and a bit of walking alongside and some people to help her. And it's completely different to when I was with her, but that's how it should be. It should be what she wants it to be. And and now she sits on the board of trustees, and she'd never been asked to do anything before, but here we are. So good.
I love that. That's fantastic. And I wonder if you could just finish off just talking about your time with just some of the big challenges. What have been the real tricky, you know, the headaches that you've kind of had to confront and work through? And I don't know whether you've had any things that you've developed, you know, tactics.
What, during the pandemic? Or?
Yeah, just the last year or so, and just, you know, what you've been up to and just how you've kind of worked it out, you know.
It's just taken a lot of thought. I think a lot of things have been better because you're working in small groups. And that wasn't, you know, that's part of what comes out of the challenge, is looking at it and thinking, well, this is what we've got, so this is what we work with. So, and because I've worked with smaller groups at the food bank, I've made deeper relationships, actually, and I've had time. And what everybody's had is lots and lots of time to make those closer relationships. And through that, I've met someone who runs the WEA in the area, and we've made a link, and we've started working with them now. But I'd never have known that if I hadn't had to work with
WEA, help us out. Sorry, what's the...
Sorry?
WEA.
Oh, WEA, Workers' Education Association.
Yeah, that's right.
I believe that they're all over the country. They started off to educate, you know, night classes for workers who hadn't finished their education, and they're a wonderful organisation. So we're working with those at the moment.
So great opportunities with partnerships and all those sort of things bubbling up. Okay, well, look, we'll come back and hear some more, maybe about a little bit about life before the pandemic, and then looking at next steps. But Steve Summers is here from the United Reformed Church. Steve, do you want to just introduce and talk a bit about church-related community work? You put on the banner behind you there, church-related community work ministry. So that's CRCWM. I don't know if that's new for 2021, and maybe that question in the chat, which is just about, I'm just scrolling back up here, whether it is just a kind of thing about mission. I'm trying to find it here. That's the problem with the chat. You kind of get...
I think it was from Michelle. I took it down. Yeah, I'll try and
let's take that
respond
one.
to
Could
that.
you please define church-related community work? Because what I'm hearing is mission, small steps in mission in a community. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Joe, Anne and Alison and everyone here. It's great. And Andy, you promised a commercial break as well. I tell you, it's so hot here in Northampton. Ice creams, popcorn, anything like that would be wonderful. It's really warm here. Hope it is where you are. I'm going to share my slides just to help, so hopefully you can all view that. Here we go. Is that okay, Andy? Can you see that? And hopefully others can as well then. Lovely. So I'm development worker for church-related community work, and also special category ministry. So that's, you know, your chaplains, your particular ministers, as it were. And we're part of the discipleship team. I have the real privilege of traveling all around Britain, seeing people, places, projects, churches. Really pleased. And yeah, Andy, it feels like centuries at times, but I mean, the United Reformed Church, we've got our 50th birthday next week. Next year, we've got parties at Greenbelt and lots of other celebrations. And it was 34 years ago that the URC first said, we really value and respect church-ready community work. So we're going to put it in our basis of union. We're actually going to make it a recognised ministry as, you know, ministers with abbreviations. Ministers of Word and Sacrament are, so are our CRCWs. They receive a stipend like a minister does, live in a manse, or gets a housing allowance, gets the pensions, terms of settlements. We value community development work so much that we formally recognise that. Part of our URC DNA is very much ecumenism, and in one sense we're proud that we recognise, you know, community development work, but how we long and pray for other denominations to recognise it as well. But hey ho. So we're very much based on professional community development, you know, and Joe Allison, all our CRCWs are professionally endorsed, qualified, trained community development workers, as well as they've done a contextual theology degree. So it's both. So on one hand, you know, they're respected by folk within the church and the officials, as it were, but also, you know, Alison, Joe, and others could go and work if there were jobs for community development workers. Not so many around nowadays. But it's very much about working in the local neighbourhood formally, rather than doing all the church bits and pieces that ministers of Word and Sacrament have to do. But it's that relatedness bit which is crucial as well, and enabling and empowering others to do it. You know, it's not like employing a youth worker like some churches do, and they do a great job, but often that youth worker can be doing it a bit on her or his own and not really taking people with them. You know, they just appointed to do the youth work. That's not how it works for CRCW. It's very much together in the approach and ethos.
Right.
So partnership, obviously this is within the church, but also widely. Normally in situations of exclusion and poverty, but, you know, I'm sure everyone's aware as you travel around Britain, where you think areas are affluent or rich, there's often pockets of poverty and exclusion. So it's about how do we recognise and identify that. Our CRCWs are a rare breed, if you don't mind me calling you that, Joe, Alison and Andy, in terms of there's only 14 at the moment commissioned to work in projects and another 4 in training. So we have to be careful where we deploy our CRCWs. It's normally for 5 years and often for 10 years. You know, it's a long-term commitment to an area. And of course, there's loads of churches and all denominations that will never have a CRCW, but are doing wonderful community presence and engagement in some form already. So yeah, you know, 62 churches, 47 different CRCWs over that 34 years. And the real prayer is people being called to this ministry. Is a calling process. It's a recognising God calling people to be CRCWs. So nearly finished, that because it's our part of our DNA, although there's the whole URC context where people come from, people can come from other denominations, and we've got a process called the Certificate of Eligibility. If you've got the appropriate experience and qualifications, then you can apply to be an accredited CRCW as well. And we're on the normal social media stuff. So yeah, if you know, URC, CRCW, put it into a search engine, it'll all pop up. So yeah, Michelle's question is about mission, you know, and often we're asked, well, is it a pioneering ministry or is it about fresh expressions? And sure, there's overlaps and there might be similarities, and it's definitely about, you know, recognizing where God's already at work, as Dot was saying, and joining in often. But often, you know, a pioneer minister or a fresh expression of church is that, you know, and as far as our CRCW ministry is involved, there's no intended outcome of boss, you know, bums on seats or new churches being established. That's not what it's about. So that's where it's slightly different. But by all means, Michelle, come back, or, you know, we can have conversation about that. Anything else, Andy, you want to
Well, I
pick
think
out, or?
we can stop screen sharing because it's nice to
Okay.
see everybody. But
Yeah,
that's been really helpful, Steve. Now, Natalie has just found that she's got a new vocation. I wonder if you could just say to help us if we're not part of the United Reformed Church, maybe we're Church of England, Baptist, Methodist. How do we connect in? How do we enjoy the benefits of this community of church-related community workers if you're not, URC?
Well, maybe this is the first of a few of these sort of conversations where anyone can join in. That might be one way. Like I say, if you feel God's calling you formally to this ministry, then have a conversation with myself and we can explore that particular. And I think as far as possible, we network, we work in partnership as widely as possible. So as well as HeartEdge, a lot of the other Christian organisations we try and get out and about and have conversations with. I don't know, Joanne and Alison could have.
Well, maybe Natalie, that's something to pick up. I don't know if we can pick that up afterwards or furthermore in the chat, but let's keep talking about that. Another question here, which I want to zigzag back to our other part. Steve, that was great. Thanks so much. Joe, Alison and Anna here. And I wondered if we've got a question here. How do you find out what ideas will work in your area? How do you target the right people and make it work? Make it work is always handy and tricky. I wonder, anybody want to jump in with a reflection on how you find out what ideas will work in your area and how you target the right people and make it work?
I think we expect the first year of any new placement, new project is about getting to know the area, getting to know the people we serve, that is church people and the wider community. For me, that it's taken a year just to begin to understand the context of Sunderland and to get to know the church people. I'm yet to listen to my community, the community the churches serve. I hope that I will be given more time for that, really, because of the pandemic. But you don't have to start from scratch. The church has been there very often for hundreds of years. So people within the church already have a story about their own community. Sometimes they've not moved on with the local community. It's changed and they've not kept up. So you always need to check it out. But it's about working with the voices that are already there and then listen to more voices, and often the ones that aren't easily heard. There are some of us that are very good at articulating what we think. There are others who are lacking in confidence and think nobody's interested in what they've got to say. And it's hearing all those voices. And when you've done that, that's the time to start suggesting, shall we do this? Could we do that? But actually, even within that time, we as CRCWs might be in a meeting and hear an opportunity and flag it up. So for instance, even though I've only been here a year, I was in a recent meeting where a credit union was saying, we're really concerned about doorstep lending. It's gone up astronomically because of the pandemic. We're looking for new venues to act as collecting points. Please contact our community development worker. I've taken that to one of the church's elders. They are currently considering it. They've asked for that community development worker with a credit union to come to the next elders meetings to see if that's a possibility for them. You just listen and look for opportunities to put things together to make it happen. But you will get it wrong along the way, and just not worry about that. Let God, look for God and see where he's guiding you. Sorry, he is my age. I still think as God as he, but whoever, whatever God is.
I'm going to ask Joe to come in a second, but before that, Anne, I don't know if you've got any reflections on this sort of this question of how you find out, it's prioritizing, isn't it? What's going to work, what isn't, and all of that, and how you target.
I'm not even sure I think that far ahead about what's going to work and what isn't. I think if somebody is talking about something that, well, just the other day, I discovered that some of my old ladies in the church used to go to a dementia cafe, but because of the pandemic, they couldn't travel to where it is. And we do have small group meetings. And it occurred to me that actually we could do those same sort of things that the dementia cafe does, but just be part of the friendship group that we'd already started. So it kind of is blending in and blending through. And now they know someone else who lives in the same block of flats who used to go to the dementia cafe, who can't anymore, who's going to come along next week. So it builds. And sometimes you can't see any further than next week or when it starts. Yes, sometimes you plan things and you spend ages. And with Project Santa, which was something we did at Christmas, we spent ages and ages planning it, and we knew it would work, and it worked, and it was just a 2-day thing, and it went. But some things, like the community stuff, you just have to start it. Just open the doors and see what happens.
So there's something here, and please, more questions, folks, in the chat, because this is going to be tedious otherwise. I don't want to say it's tedious, but, let's just spark it up with some really toughy reality questions, please. Elephants in the room, chuck them in. Anne, just help me out with this, though. You sound like you've got a very long lead. You're listening to people, you're thinking we can pivot in this direction, move in that direction. Do you work with colleagues who are a little bit more cautious or wanting to sort of just, inertia? How do you manage inertia?
Yes, sometimes you get that, but I have to say in Billingham, I haven't had so much of that. I haven't had so much of that'll never work.
Okay.
And they're when you say a long lead, I think, yes, I kind of have, because there's only me. And if I can take responsibility for it, if it goes wrong, then that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
And I do. And I just think if I think something's going to work and people are keen for me to do something, well, we'll give it a go. Go on. What have you got to lose? What have you got to lose?
So
Nothing.
it's partly your capacity to be persuasive, but it's actually maybe you've got a bunch of people around you who are willing to take a risk, or willing to turn a blind eye, or willing to, I don't know, hopefully not turn a blind eye.
The elders of the church are very willing to take a risk. And I think churches that have got a CRCW have already taken that risk. They've already thought about it beforehand, before they applied to have a CRCW project.
We know, though, that there are many churches that don't have a CRCW. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what's partly the climate here that we need to do some of this pivoting, this kind of listening, and then we're going to shift, which is what you've kind of described, So, yeah. I don't know if you want to, sorry, Anne.
And I think that all churches could do what we're doing. Yes, I'm a kind of a conduit in that I'm the contact point, really, in that people kind of know I'm there, and they go, hey, do you want to do this thing? Because they know my name.
Yeah.
But a church just needs one of those, or needs a group of those who can take those opportunities and run with them.
Yeah. I'd like, Joe, I don't know if you could look at Michelle Sims' question here. Here goes then, how can you get a congregation to connect with their community when they haven't done so up to now? And also their motivation would be BOS. I'm going to come to you in a second, though, because I want to tackle Jim's question. And I wondered, Anne, if you could just, I listened to the story about food banks here, and I know there are all kinds of different food banks, but for many of them, well, for some of them, maybe, it's all about doing to people, doing for people, often, in hugely challenging circumstances and in a context of perhaps grinding poverty, and it's visceral. But, there's a question here about also the systemic root problems behind the need for a food bank. And I just wonder how you bump into that, because there's something also in community work, it seems to me, about confronting injustice and taking sides and putting your head above the parapet. How do we do that? How are you bumping into that element? And maybe if it's too early days for you, I don't know if you've got experiences from days past, or.
I think it's where you have to work with the bigger groups. You have to work with the people who got the voice into the injustice that you see. In Newcastle, there were some amazing local councillors that were working towards environmental justice, actually. And they did get a large grant and started the Greening Wingrove project, if you wanted to look it up. It's in Fenham in Newcastle. And it was all about environmental problems in that area. And it was the church I was working with got into that right from the beginning because it was in their area, and they were happy to jump on board and go, yeah, we can see the relevance of this. So they were part of a bigger movement. I think on our own, we're a little bit working with individuals, but when you get the individuals working together for something that they can see the relevance of, it's making people see that, or helping people to see the relevance of what's happening. And certainly the environmental stuff that happened in Fenham is still carrying on, even though Greening Wingrove ended about 4 years ago. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody wants to chip in here and just talk about some of the work of Poilo Free Air or some of the ideas around that. But there's something there again about raising consciousness and then acting in a way that's about tackling root problems here, rather than simply confronting the symptoms of that, if you like. Alison, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I can do. I can talk about when I was training in Cheetham Hill in Manchester. It was back in the early 2000s when refugees and asylum seekers became more of a problem than it had been previously. Some would say it's continued to be more of a problem and is getting even more important nowadays. But at that time, as a student, I heard lots of people, health visitors that I was beginning to meet, talking about this being an issue. The church was in a very multicultural, multiracial area, but did not have any understanding of that as being an issue. And so we worked with one of the citywide organisations, Refugee Action and others, and we did a series of workshops which they led with the church and possible partners like the early days of the children's centres and other organisations across the city, which led to us forming the Welcome Centre. Now, at the beginning of that process, the church had no energy for that. They didn't know it was a problem. But taking the time and working with other partners and taking them on the journey, within 6 months, a centre had formed, which is still functioning, no longer in that church, I'm afraid, but was until 6 years ago still functioning in that church, but is now in a different building within that same area. That church gave that legacy,
right?
Made that happen without knowing they needed to make that happen.
Yeah. So it's about the church building alliances, connecting in, joining in where they can, and taking sides, maybe. Okay. I don't know, Anna.
And being willing to be changed by the experience.
Oh, yeah, okay. There's some more stories behind that, I suppose.
Because that always happens.
Yeah. Okay. And anything to add to that? I don't know whether you want to.
Though a similar thing happened in the West End of Newcastle, as the West End Refugee Service was started in a URC in the West End of Newcastle. So church's sacrificial giving actually made a big difference.
Okay. Joe, we had this question, which we should come back to. I've lost it in the chat. I don't know if you remember it, because I did ask.
Is it the one about getting your congregation to connect with the community?
Yeah. Well, this is a challenge, isn't it? And then, the whole agenda around bums on seats, we should come back to that, because it's screaming in the ears of many churches, I think. And they've got, I don't know.
I don't know if there's a freedom. Is there a freedom in saying church is not about that? And so you can let your foot off the accelerator and say, actually, you can think about how you live as church in a different way. But that is about talking to congregations gently, using really particular language over a protracted period of time, and talking about bravery and change, and talking about the gospel-driven. Jesus didn't just sit down and say, come to me, and all of that. He was about change and about listening to women and listening to the sick and listening to the tax collector and, doing all of that change. And so aren't we driven to do that? And I think we come in congregations frightened of what's going to happen. frightened of taking a risk, and frightened of being a bit brave. And it's okay for it to go wrong to a certain degree and change it or to stop things. And I think people need to be held in that journey of understanding that change is inevitable. It's happening all the time, but we can do it, and we can do it well. And you also need to talk in worship about what that looks like. So I could talk about it all the time during the week, but I also preach about it, and we talk about it as a whole congregation. So I think you need to take gentle steps and use really non-frightening language, but you have to talk about change, because that's how you connect with your community. And you also, I think, have to understand that you're not always right as a church. So you might be thinking, oh, this is what my community needs, but you haven't listened to anybody outside the building, so it might be completely the wrong thing. And so we need to be very much about saying, oh, the people on this street don't have a residents association, so we'd like to start that, because they're telling us that's what we want. Whereas the church might have thought, oh, everybody's fine, but what they need is a cafe. But they don't need that. They need a residents association. So it is about the language we use when we talk about change and bravery, you know, and holding people nicely in that conversation.
And what happens though when things you start to get people coming in, the tax collector or whoever it is with that, you know, unpopular reputation, or whoever starts to move in? There are some practical dynamics here, maybe. What are the implications?
From a safeguarding point of view, you could have things in place that help the people that apparently, you know, people make a judgment, don't they, whether they should be in your congregation or not. But surely if we're welcome, we're welcome. And we have people just wandering into our worship with their dog or their bicycle or whatever, and, you know, just come in and it's not a problem. And I think we need to find ways of understanding that people do things in life and none of us is perfect. And isn't it better to be helping somebody to join a community, whatever their point of faith is, whatever they've done, and show them that, rather than saying no from the outset? And there are ways of managing that, and you might want to do that depending on what you think that person has done in their previous life. But, you know, we're all shaped by our experiences, aren't we? And we all deserve an opportunity to be part of a loving community. And if we're not really doing church very well, if we're telling people at the door that we've made a judgment that they can't come in.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd like to hear from Alison and Anne on this question of nurturing this connection with the community and the implications for that, when, you know, that just might not be the culture of the church. But I wonder, Joe, whether you could just speak to Jim Robertson's comment about social justice and what the distinctive contribution of churches and their ministries are re-challenging injustice. I wonder if that's something that you found yourself doing in Peckham, you know, that you're looking behind the symptoms, if you like, and trying to get, I don't know if you're political or there's any kind of campaigning, or can you talk about that?
We don't campaign, but we're very open about what we think when we talk to people who come into the community, and we would have many outspoken people. It's a very multicultural church and area, and we would talk about it in worship, about social justice weekly, probably. There'd be something in the sermon or in the prayers or whatever. When George Floyd died, we were asked by members of the congregation to preach about it and to bring it as a conversation, and then we have a conversation about it, and it was felt very keenly that people wanted to have in person, and we couldn't when that happened. So we're waiting to do that. There's a lot of talking about sharing the lived experiences of people who live in injustice. But then I will go to the Labour Party meeting because I've been invited to speak about food inequality, and with Southwark Council to talk about food inequality, and happily sit there and say, but you're not dealing with the cause, and it's not to be celebrated. We have more people going to the food bank. It's to be talked about how we're going to stop this and what we're going to do in 6 months' time when more people are off furlough, and what we're going to do about all of that. So it's about spreading yourself out amongst people who have a bigger voice. I think Anne said that earlier, you know, and making sure that you carry on that conversation with people who come in the centre and the church, so that everybody's talking about the same conversation and having it on their radar, whether it's a local councillor or somebody who comes to worship on a Sunday. It's the same thing, isn't it?
And are you kind of doing that facilitating as well, that enabling? You're finding that maybe there are people in the church who will speak up, that kind of prophetic or that kind of vocal, dissent, if you like, that you would, endorse, support.
We're an inclusive church on the Inclusive Church, website, on their database, and we have a large lesbian, gay, trans community proportionally in our church. And we flew the diversity pride flag for the whole of Pride outside our church, for example. And it's unusual in an Anglican context. And the Anglican Church are having a conversation at the moment called Living, Love and Faith. And some people didn't want to do anything. But our elders said, actually, we're very proactive in this conversation about that social justice issue. And just because we're comfortable with what we do doesn't mean we shouldn't go to talk to churches who are uncomfortable about having that conversation. And that's exactly what we should do. And that's what they're doing, is that they want to get involved with congregations who don't have an inclusive, welcoming, or are uncomfortable with that conversation, and saying, well, actually, this is what we found in our congregation, and this is what we value, and this is what we love about these people. And they just come to church as far as they're concerned. Yeah. To take that mystery away, so they go out and do it without us needing to do it with them. Isn't that how it should be, really?
Like it, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, Anne, whether you want to come in and just comment on Michelle's question here about how you get your congregation to connect with the community when they haven't done so up to now, and that kind of, they might be motivated all around the BOS, bums on seats. How do you subvert that?
Sorry, I didn't see the question.
Yeah, it's miles up in the chat now. This is the way I'll read to you. How can you get a congregation to connect with their community when they haven't done so up to now, and also their motivation would be bums on seats? Apart from leaving that congregation, how do you work with them? Yeah. How do you kind of connect and I think
Joe does the same as me. We do, preach it sometimes too. I know not all CRCWs preach, but it is something that I've found quite handy. Is that we preach on something like that. But the bums on seats thing is probably most members of the congregation would say, we want lots of people just like us to come in, but that's not going to happen. But if the reason that they do something different is that in the beginning, I'm not sure I mind. I'm not sure that if their motivation isn't the same as mine, I don't think I mind, because as time goes on, it will become not their motivation. And the understanding will develop, I think, as you work together with them.
So it needs that kind of continual messaging and relationship and.
I think so. And we had conversation before the pandemic. We had a big conversation in the church about the Welcome Directory. I don't know if you've heard about the Welcome Directory. It's a directory of churches that are willing to welcome ex-offenders, people coming out of prison who perhaps come to faith in prison but have nowhere to go when they come out. So there's a directory of churches that will be welcoming to those people. And we had a big church meeting about whether we should put our name on it. And with all the safeguarding that happens, we decided as a church that yes, we would. And so we are in the Welcome Directory. And that was a huge thing for our church.
Big statement, big process. Everybody signs up to it.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you got anything to Alison Dalton, whether you've got anything you want to comment on in terms of just, that question that Michelle's put in the chat about connecting with your community, or maybe they haven't done so.
I think I agree with Anne about, for me, as a church-related community worker, my church or churches are communities too. And so it's about working where they are, not where I would like them to be. And I'll tell you a story from my days in Poole at an Anglican church there. It was the early days of Messy Church, when churches didn't know about Messy Church much. One of the churches I served down there was the first church to have a Messy Church in Poole, alongside a Baptist church up the road. And by the end we had formed a Messy Church network across Poole with 13 Messy churches, and tried to coordinate them so they weren't happening all at the same time, to enable families to wander around and get church every week rather than just once a month if they wanted to. And at one of the network meetings, an Anglican church, a very lovely lady who'd been part of the Messy Church there, said, we set up this thinking we wanted to do something to get younger people into church. There was a few of us with kids, and we thought, well, we'd get some together, and we went to the local sink estate up the road thinking we were better than them, and we just wanted to get them into church. But actually, we've realized now we love them, and they've given us much more than we've ever given them.
Some heads nodding.
And that's what my point about this stuff changes you. And if it means you start from wanting to get bums on seats, whether you're successful or not, it doesn't matter. By the end, you will be a different church, and that's what's important.
Interesting little comment. Thanks so much, Alison. Great. These stories are really helpful, I think, in providing a little context to where we are. Many of the congregation will already be out in the community, but take off their church hat, writes Natalie in the chat, i.e. they have separated their day-to-day life from their church life. Do they have language to share their faith with others? And you commented on that. I just wonder if you talked to Natalie's thing in the post, because, that in the chat, that kind of... you've got people in the congregation, they put their little churchy hat on or whatever it is, their expectation. When actually maybe it goes back to what we were saying right at the start, that it's about community work. We're all community workers and we're doing community work. So
everybody's doing it. You'd be surprised. I told Natalie in the chat there, I at the Morpeth Church, we did a presentation on a Sunday morning because you can't ask them to come out specially. So we did a presentation. We had a big map. And we got everybody to stick a sticker on all the different places where they did work in their community, volunteer for nothing or whatever. And there were 127 interventions from a congregation of only 50. This is what they do. They're already doing it. And my guess is that they already have conversations about what happens in their lives. They've built relationships, and people know that part of what makes them do what they do is that they're church people, is their Christian conscience that makes them do it. So they're already changed about their own lives in whatever they do.
Joe, I don't know whether you wanted to come in on that, or Alison.
I think I agree with that. And I think there's a lot that people do but just don't see it as part of church. But it is going to be on the PTA of your children's school, or going to get milk for your neighbour, or picking up their kids from school, whatever it is that you're doing, somebody's lawn, delivering a newsletter. You need to see church as part of everything that we do, and that it's everyday life, isn't it? Not just about Sunday.
So help me out here. Is the church gathering then, the service that happens that many people refer to as church, is actually part of that, the agenda of that? We're checking in on our community work. Maybe somebody's got a story to talk about as a school governor, or they're on the PTA, or they're, volunteering, or they're just having a very stressful time. It's part of the service to provide opportunities for people to check in and to share some of their stories. Are there mechanisms for that?
I've been to, so often if I'm preaching, we have cafe church once a month where we sit around tables, we eat a lot, which is always great, eating together. And then in the sermon, there might be a break where they have to build something, or write about something, or talk to each other. We have quizzes in our sermons, and also, pre-pandemic and all that kind of thing, to get people to talk to each other, and it will be about those things. And then, there might be a more formal time. I've worked in churches where there's a particular time after the notices to say, what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? And what are you up to this time tomorrow? So people can start to share a little bit about their lives, or thank God for something that's happened that week. I thank God that my neighbour went and got me a cup of tea when I couldn't go myself, or I thank God for somebody who babysat my kids so that I could go shopping, or whatever it might be. We have to make those times happen, because it's not always in every culture of every church to be that sharing. And we have to give people the freedom and the opportunity to have their voice like that, about important social justice things, but also about their day-to-day life.
Yeah.
The piece in our church can take 15 minutes if they want it to, because that's what they're doing in the piece, is checking in and saying what they've been up to. So I think we need to engage people in a practical way, so they don't just come and absorb what's happening, but they're also encouraged to say what's in their own life.
Great tactics. There's a little comment in the chat here I wanted to come to. Oh goodness. What are the thoughts about church running? This is Stuart here. Running community initiatives, hubs, or just encouraging Christians to get stuck into communities and into other organizations. So there's a question here, it seems to me, about, is the church about running stuff and setting stuff up, or is it about just saying to people, join in? There's, volunteer at Mind, at Age Concern, the shop, or, get stuck into where you're at. What are your thoughts? Panel. I wonder, Anne, if you'd comment on this. Is it both and, or should the church be setting things up, or is it all about joining?
It's both and. I think you encourage people as they can and as they have the confidence to get involved in whatever's happening. It's great, and it really enlivens everybody else in the church, because then they've got a story to tell too, and who knows what might happen. Yeah. Okay.
So it's a mixed economy, as they say, I think. Alison, I don't know if you've got any thoughts. Are you more of a joiner-innerer than a setter-upperer?
I think it's relevant to every context. Every context is different, and for some churches, the having people use their building is the best way of doing it, and that's not to be devalued. But alongside that, there are churches that have links that they aren't aware they can monopolize, make use of, whatever the right word is. I'm thinking of when I was in the Northwest, I helped a church I was invited by their minister of Word and Sacrament to talk to the church elders around bringing their church out into the community in a more rural setting. And within the conversation, I talked about social prescribing and were people linked to their doctors, and was there some linkage about what the church was already doing with social prescribing? And that led to a conversation afterwards as people left about so-and-so being in the Rotary and so-and-so being on the council. And actually there's all these networks we're already linked into. We started a conversation, and they hadn't thought about that before.
Absolutely fantastic stuff. Love that. I don't know if you got anything to add, Joe. I don't know whether you're a setter-upperer, a joiner-innerer, whether you want to do both, whether you can cultivate a space where people feel that they can do both. Some of the comments in the chat about testimony and sharing here about where we're at.
I think you can just try things and see if it works, and make people feel comfortable doing things. I think do what you feels better for you. We, I suppose, as a church are about giving a space for things to happen. So people might come and have a political meeting in our church, we'd be quite happy to support that. Extinction Rebellion are quite active where we are, and they would come and use it for their drumming practice, because that's important to them, and the state of the planet's important to us as a church, so there's something about setting things up but with people. And so you're all joining in together. It's not me setting it up and that's my thing. I think we'd all be a bit like that. I'm setting this up. We're all setting this up together. One day I'm going to go. So I'm setting it up so that you will keep it going. I think that's probably where I would sit. And I would do that anywhere in the community, not just in my church building. And I would help anybody in the community in their building as well.
Brilliant. Okay. We've got about, I think we said we'd finish in about 15 minutes. So we've got a bit of time here. I don't know if there are any other final questions, people commenting. in the chat. I just wondered, maybe we could kind of finish with thoughts going forward, and particularly we've been talking about how you connect to your community. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you engage and involve people, and just growing participation, not just that kind of awareness of the community, but actually about nurturing participation, involvement. You can have a church where it's always down to the usual suspects, particularly maybe Anne in the context, Alison in the context, in Peckham, the context you're describing, where it's maybe it's a smaller congregation, and it always comes down to the usual. How do you break out of that, and maybe how do you engage with people outside of the church to involve them in participation? I don't know if anyone's got examples or things they can talk about in terms of participation. Alison, then we'll come to Anne, and then we'll come to Joe, and then we'll finish. But more questions, comments in the chat. And if this has been useful, please note it. That would be helpful if we want to do another one. And also, if there are particular topics around this that you think we should look at in the future, please doodle it in the chat, and then we can maybe try and hatch a plot and take it forward. But I interrupted you, Alison. You were about to share an insight.
I was just going to say, and it might link into Jim's comment about the public square as well. Yeah. The project I served in Poole was 3 churches supporting a project that was outside of the church, really, and it was around new development in 2 council wards, massive people joining the communities. So the population was going to go up from anything from 48% to 79% in the 10 years of the projected 10 years of the new builds. And it was partially funded by the council, and we had Faithworks Wessex as the secretariat. So the project was owned by the URC and flagged by the URC and by Faithworks Wessex and by Poole Borough Council. And the work, therefore, was very, very much about recruiting new volunteers in new ground with the church's support. And the first year to 2 years there, I spent knocking on people's doors with people with me, including community development workers and housing officers, asking people about what they thought about this new area they moved into and what they'd like to change and how we could work together. Mapping what was already going on and what they saw was issues that could be beginning to show, and developing work from that. So the first 18 months was really about listening to people, but also going to church services and public meetings, saying, this is what we're here for, tell us what we need to be doing, here's some post-it notes, what do you think needs to happen? And that then gave us the aims we worked for the next 7 to 9 years. So, it's about talking to people, again, building relationships in those conversations that then leads to what you need to do.
But it seems to me, Alison, what you're describing isn't about building participation in the congregation. It's about building participation all over the place. Church, community, Absolutely. Bring them all in.
Absolutely right. I mean, I will say that was a very defined project that was very different to many are, but that's the way I work anyway. I'll work with anyone and everyone, whether they're church people, whether they're people of faith, whether they're not. We are here to serve our communities as well as our church. We are church related community workers, not as when I was going through the assessment process, my sending church secretary would talk about me being a community-related church worker. I am not that. I am a church-related community worker. My focus is on community, but linked to church.
And to me, it just sounds like what every church ought to be about. But there are particular skills which we've bumped into a little bit in our conversation here that I think are really important. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this subject about engaging and involving people. I don't know whether you're looking specifically to involve the church in participating, or again, you've blown the doors off and you're working church and community.
Yes, I think I always have, and I think that's just the way I see it, because people are people. I think you will always get the usual suspects who don't want to join in. But if you have something that is relevant to them, then you might pique their interest, and you might get them going. That there is a really shy guy who comes to our church, who the one thing that really gets him going is the garden. And he does the garden all around, and he's really taken ownership of that garden. And not only that, but he keeps sending me links about all these Christian greening, climate change, justice, that sort of stuff. I get loads of links that he sends me because he's really got on board with this whole thing. And if something fires somebody up, that's when they'll get involved. And they might not otherwise. He doesn't involve himself in anything else, but this is his thing. Yeah.
So it's all, again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's finding opportunities and nurturing that kind of opportunity for people to participate. Yeah. And do you find that you're reaching out into the community? Do you blur the boundaries? How do you do that? How do you engage people outside of the church to participate and to get involved?
I don't think they know that. Some of them don't even know that I'm church.
Okay. And is that problematic? I mean, do you think?
No, I've never found it so. I get involved because I get involved, and because sometimes you do things just because it needs doing, and that's my motivation, because it needs doing. And then they find out that I'm church, or I work for the church, and some of them are a little surprised, but it doesn't stop them wanting to work with me and letting me work with them. No.
Okay. Folks, I hope this has been useful, and if there's an appetite, we can do another one of these. I don't know if people have got particular questions or comments, just to put it in the chat. That would be helpful feedback, whether there are particular aspects of this topic that we want to hone in on next time. Elephants in the room we haven't tackled, don't know. But Joe, this question of how you engage and involve people, and whether you're just working with a church clientele and community and the usual suspects there, or whether you blow open the doors. It's about that broader participation. What are your tactics and approaches?
Yeah, it's about the broader participation, and it's also about listening to the small conversations that happen. So we have mindfulness classes. The vicar is a mindfulness teacher, and we have somebody else who comes to help him with that. Out of conversations we had in our community cafe pre-pandemic of people needing a space to do that. So he went and got taught to do it, and now that's what we do. We also, in the pandemic, for the people picking up their meals, well, some were coming very overwhelmed by the anxiety of coming out of their homes for the first time. Coming and talking to our volunteer who's giving them their meal, and really needing support in that instance. So we've set up a volunteer immediate emotional support 2 hours on the same time for people who feel like that, who can come and see a qualified therapist with a view to either seeing her regularly or going into our counselling service, which is from £2 an hour for unwaged and without recourse to public funds, up to £45 an hour. And so they can then be referred on. So it's a holistic way of looking at it, that somebody came upset, needing a conversation. So we've enabled their participation in our service. They now volunteer on another thing. It's about that, isn't it? About the ebb and flow, really, of people. And just having a conversation about, oh, if you're upset, come and sit down with me and tell me what's going on. So we started a new thing on that person saying, what I really need is this. There you go. That's not very difficult.
Fantastic. And Joe, just to check, your context is a United Reformed Church and a Church of England church together?
Local ecumenical partnership. Okay. It has been since 1978.
Okay, so there's a kind of, but you're able to access that church-related community worker network. Steve, you posted in the chat something about some of the training opportunities. Do you just want to quickly comment on that? The Luther King House?
No, just have a look. Luther King Centre, they just changed the name to, but the sessions.
Oh, you just pop your mic on accidentally. Pop your mic back on again.
Sorry about that. Yeah, many of them are online. They're short courses, so yeah, just go and have a look and have a conversation.
Thanks, everybody. We're out of time, I think, unless anyone's got any final comments, things we needed to have said that we haven't done, or final points to add. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope this has been useful, taking the lid off a topic maybe that's hopeful for you. And yeah, if there are any questions or comments, we might be able to pick this up again in the autumn, or do one of these again. But just to say a big thank you to Joe Patterson and Alison Dalton and Anne Honey for great contributions and stories and insight and wisdom, and really, really fantastic. And maybe we'll do something like this, and we'll catch up again, and we'll tackle some of this. Any final comments, folks?
Just thank you, Andy, and thank HeartEdge. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Good. Well, have a good night, everybody. I think we're done. Great. See you soon.
Bye.